Right, next up we've got CC11, which is metals and extraction of metals. I've got an example of extraction of a metal. I've got iron oxide, and I'm going to react it with carbon. So this is just a simple displacement reaction I think we're all comfortable with. Carbon is more reactive than iron, therefore carbon will take iron's place. And on the product side, I've got carbon with the oxygen, and you can write carbon oxide or you can write carbon dioxide. And I've got the iron left by itself. So I've used carbon to take iron's place, and now I'm left with pure iron, which is what I want. I can use iron to build something. The question that commonly gets asked here that a student makes mistakes on is they'll ask you what's oxidized and what's reduced. Oxidation, we know, is the loss of electrons, but it's also just the addition of oxygen. And reduction is the removal of oxygen, and that's the one that typically throws people off. They'll ask you what is reduced. Now hopefully you'll be able to see that on the left hand side the oxygen is with iron, and on the right hand side there is no oxygen with iron. So we can see, going from the left to the right, you are removing oxygen from the iron oxide. When you're asked what is reduced, what students will often write is they'll write iron. They'll say iron has lost oxygen. Okay? Iron doesn't have oxygen to lose. Iron oxide has oxygen to lose. If you write iron, you won't get the mark. You have to write iron oxide. Iron oxide is reduced because iron oxide has oxygen and it loses it. Okay, so make sure you mention the oxide. The other one, they'll ask you what is oxidized. So what doesn't have oxygen on the left, that does have oxygen on the right. And the answer for that one is going to be carbon. Carbon starts off with no oxygen and ends up with oxygen. So carbon is oxidized. So when you're answering these questions, you're always looking at the reactants side. And you're going to write your answer exactly as it appears on the reactant side. It's iron oxide on the reactant side. It's iron oxide that's reduced. Carbon, it's carbon that's oxidized. Okay, so make sure you include the oxygen there. The other question then that they ask, which we all know, well I think we do, although some of you tend to lose one of the 2 marks on this one, if they gave you something that looked like this instead, if they gave you, let's say, aluminium oxide, which I'm too lazy to write out in full, so I'm going to write the symbol, aluminium oxide and carbon. And they might tell you that there's no reaction, or you cannot use carbon to obtain pure aluminium, and they'll ask you why. And just the way you phrase this is quite important. You have to tell me that carbon is less reactive than aluminium, and then you have to say, therefore, carbon cannot displace aluminium. I'm going to point out 1 or 2 things that students say that's wrong. One thing you won't get the marks for is if you're too vague. If you just say carbon is less reactive than what? You have to say it's less reactive than aluminium. Other thing you might say that is vague is if you just say aluminium is reactive. Okay, it has to be a comparative statement. You're comparing the reactivity of carbon and aluminium. Both of them need to be included in this first sentence. Once you've written your first sentence, your second point will have to be something along these lines. Carbon cannot displace aluminium. Carbon cannot take aluminium's place. Aluminium cannot be displaced by carbon. Something along that lines, but you do need to mention, because it's less reactive, it cannot be displaced. Other than that, I think CC11 is relatively straightforward. Do have a look over the other oxidation and reduction questions, the ones that involve electrons. There is a separate video on that for you to have a look at. And the other thing I would advise is all of the biological extraction methods. It's not difficult, but it has to be learned. What is phytoextraction? What is bioleaching? I mean, they could potentially give you a 6 marker on something like that. So make sure you know what they are. The other thing they could ask you about is the life cycle assessment. Not the most fascinating, okay? It's just about the steps you need to consider if you're going to manufacture a new product. Really easy content, but if you don't learn it, it'll be hard to pick up all the marks, okay? You can't just pure waffle your way through the answers. Have a look at it. Phytoextraction, bioleaching, life cycle assessment, and about recycling metals. Not difficult content, but if it comes up as a 6 marker, it'll be worth a lot of marks, and you'll be annoyed with yourself if you haven't at least looked over it.